Well, good morning, class. Time for another installation of the survey course. So last time we were together, we were establishing the Italian Renaissance. We looked at the Quattrocento, the Trecento before that, and seen these big ideas that got up and running, this rediscovery of antiquity and so on. So the first slide I have up is just to kind of be a quick reminder of that Renaissance as it was emerging in Italy. There's a Giotto meeting at the Golden Gate there, and then Masaccio's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Before we move into what we're going to do next, I want to just make a couple broad comments, a little bit more stylistic comments about this Italian Renaissance and what used to be called taste, but now we'll just refer to as style. You'll notice that if you just sort of look at these abstractly, that the Italians have a very strong emphasis on large form, kind of powerful form. Maybe it's easiest to see in the Masaccio here, the way the figures are done, but they're really interested in this idea of the beauty, dignity of the form of the figure. A term often used is a sense of monumentality, of presence. And so if you look at that, Masaccio really is emphasizing the large forms of the figure against rather simplified forms of the background. In fact, that background is really just sky, ground, and a bit of a mountain, and then the gate, the angel. So you read this in terms of large forms composed together, modeled in light and shadow. And so there's a kind of a heroic, abstract level of form that is part of what gives this painting its power. Of course, the narrative and the emotion expressed equally gives it its power. So I want to emphasize that kind of large abstract form quality in the Italian. And that is actually part of the Italianate tradition. And as we talked about, it goes right back to ancient Rome and to ancient Greece. And that is their sensibility, what we call a classical sensibility. Now, where we want to go today is to Northern Europe. We're going to go up first to France just a little bit, and then up to the Netherlands. And as we go there, you're going to see that they too have a Renaissance, but it's a bit different. It's a lot less this interest in rediscovering antiquity, and it's more in a kind of sense of naturalism. But their taste or their style is a little different. It's less heroic, less monumental, less classical. It's much more focused on detail, ornament, jewel-like colors. So there's a different feel, and that's a nice thing to get a sense of right away. So let's head there. So we'll go to France first, and we'll spend just a little bit of time in France. And I'm bringing back a couple things you met earlier when we were looking at the 14th century in Italy. And at the tail end of that lecture, I included these painted manuscripts by the Lambourg brothers. Just remind you a bit that they came from what's called the Book of Hours. You can see there the Les Très Riches Heures, the Duc de Berry, the month of October. And so this was a prayer book. It would have had the psalms and prayers. It would have been for morning devotions by very, very wealthy people. I won't repeat things I said about it because I've already done that in a previous lecture. But I bring it back as a way of introducing your eyes to this more northern aesthetic that we're going to see. And so, here again, you do find interest in the narrative, in figures in space and all of that. But it's not especially classical. It's not kind of Greco-Roman, but rather it's kind of specific, detailed, naturalistic, set in daily life. And that's a feature we're going to find in the Northern Renaissance. Part of their interest is going to be in what we might think of as more ordinary life, and then finding ways to insert or discover the divine, the profound within ordinary life. So it's less abstract than the Italian, more concrete. and that's going to make it very interesting. So this was the October month. I think we also looked at the February month. Um, Before we move from France, I want to look at one other illuminated manuscript, or book with painted pictures in it, because it's a set of ideas about how they get this idea of meaning in. And it comes out very clearly in this other manuscript. So the manuscript is known as the Hours of Mary of Burgundy. Mary of Burgundy was a noble in France in the 15th century, late 1400s, and she hired a master painter to do a prayer book for her with images. We don't know that painter's name, and so he or she is just known as the master of Mary of Burgundy. I'm going to look at two images with you coming out of that manuscript. Now, keep in mind, this is a book, so you would be holding it in your hands. It's not a big painting on a wall or an altarpiece. It's something you're holding in your hands, and so there's an intimacy to that. And that's actually very important for this painter, who's going to really do amazing things with these little images painted in a prayer book. So you're holding it in your hands. It's kind of an up-close personal quality. And of course, you probably should pretend that you are Mary of Burgundy, because she's probably the only person that would have been using this book for her devotions. So I'll just call all of you Mary, and there you are, Mary. You're sitting in your chapel or wherever looking at this book. And as you turn the page, you come to this image. So what are you looking at in this image? Remember this idea that came out of the Italian Renaissance of a painting as a window. This painter takes that very literally, and it's as if you are looking through a window, or almost as if you're in this room, and what you're actually looking at in the foreground is yourself. That's a portrait of Mary of Burgundy, seated there in her devotions. In fact, she's holding a book as she meditates. The book she's holding is the book you're holding. So it's a book within a book. It's a portrait within a book dedicated to her. And she sits there in her dressed in her finery, with her lovely little lap dog there on her lap, in her prayers and devotions. You see there's a little ledge to the right of her, and you can see some objects on that. There's some flowers. There's what looks like kind of a necklace hanging down. Excuse me. That's actually a rosary, which would be part of her devotions, of using the rosary to pray. And then next to that, there's a vase of flowers with some iris in them. The iris is a symbol. It's Mary's personal symbol, but also a symbol for the suffering of Christ. So, foreground then, in a really beautiful little room with leaded glass windows, you see yourself at prayer. Now, when you pray, you are taken to another space, right? Spiritual space, devotional space. And that's part of what our painter here wants to depict, is Mary going to this prayer book, going into prayer, and being transported into a different space, a spiritual space as a result. So how can the painter show that other layer of reality that is a spiritual layer of reality? Well, he uses the window. But in this case, we have a window inside the window. So think of the whole painting as a window. We've looked through that window and see Mary there. If we go a little deeper, you see another window, and your eyes are able to pass through that window into a large interior space. What is that space? Well, obviously it's a Gothic cathedral, probably the very church that Mary would have worshipped in. So in other words, the foreground space is a space of this world, what was often called a profane or secular space. But the interior deep space of the church is a sacred space. So part of what this painting is about is how we live in the ordinary world of profane secular space, doing our business, but there's also constantly an awareness that there's another space, a sacred space. And the life of faith is one that knows how to navigate from that outer space into that inner space. So our painter here uses the device of the window, open and letting us see through into that spiritual space. It's a really brilliant device. This is going to be used often in northern painting, and we're going to see that a few more times. Now, let's go on and move into that space. And what do you see in there? Well, this gets interesting because what you see in there, of course, is the Virgin Mary seated with the Christ child on her lap. This is the humble Mary. She's seated on a kind of a carpet, and there's 4 candlesticks at each corner of that carpet. They're supported by angels. Now, a little hard to see, but if you look at that carpet where the Virgin Mary sits and look to the left front corner of it, you see there again Mary of Burgundy, again dressed in her finery, but this time a different dress. And she is kneeling devotionally and adoring the Christ child that Mary holds in her lap. Mary and Mary, by the way, of course. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the internal prayer life of Mary of Burgundy, whereas in the foreground you see the external prayer life as she looks at a book. And then if you look again at Mary, Virgin Mary with Christ child, you'll see that where she is seated is actually on the step right in front of the altar that is behind her. You can see that kind of white box or table-like form behind her. That's the altar where the bread and the wine would be placed for Eucharist. And of course, the bread and the wine represent the body and the blood of Christ who is sacrificed. So in the middle ground, then you see actually the body of Christ as baby Jesus, right in front of the altar, where as an adult, his body and blood will be placed as the Eucharist. And then notice just on the back of that white table, that altar, there is a painting. It looks kind of gold and it's got a rounded top. That's an altarpiece painting. And all of this is in the center of the church, of sacred space. So a brilliant devotional device, brilliant way of depicting that. Let's look at another painting from this same. All right, so here you've now turned a few pages in that book of prayers, that book of hours of Mary's, and you come to another image. So let's look at what's going on in this image. Again, you have this motif of foreground as you look into the painting with objects in it, and then a window internal to the painting that you look through out now into a kind of a landscape. So let's go spatial layer by spatial layer and read each layer of space and see what the painter has given us. So let's start in that foreground. If you look in that foreground, lower right, you see that prayer book of Mary's again, open. In this case, Mary, however, is gone. So we're only seeing the prayer book. Now it's a little hard to see, but if you look at the page it's open to, the left side there, it's open to an image of the crucifixion. It's what we call the devotional crucifixion. It's a very simple image of just 3 figures, Christ on the cross, the Virgin Mary to the left, and St. John the Evangelist to the right. This is a sort of iconic image of the crucifixion, and it's meant for us to meditate on. While you meditate on that, the idea is you would then imagine the real or historical crucifixion as part of your prayers. Now, if you look through that window, you actually see the historical crucifixion happening. So it's like now this window has moved us into spiritual space, but also into historical space. And in there you see the whole cast of characters. There's Jesus being nailed to the cross, still laying there on the ground. To the left of that is Mary fainting, and in red, John holding Mary up. In the background, the whole cast of characters, the centurion, the Romans, and the crowd, even the 2 thieves on the cross already crucified there in the background. If you look in the foreground of that, actually let's go back to the windowsill and slip through that window again. Now if you look on the windowsill, you see that cushion with Mary's rosary there for prayer. And so one assumes she's praying, but she's gone. Well, if you move just inside that window, You can see right in the center a figure dressed in light blue dress with a darker blue hat. And she's actually turning and looking back out at us. That's Mary Burgundy. This is another portrait of her. It's tucked inside. And so the idea here is that through prayer of that devotional image in the rosary, she herself is transported back to the reality of Christ's crucifixion. So now our window helps us travel in time and space as well. Really brilliant device. One last thing, if you look again in the foreground, go to the far left and let your eye move upward. You see some sculpture that would be part of the ornament of this window. And that sculpture depicts Abraham sacrificing Isaac. You can see Isaac kneeling over there and Abraham behind him, arm raised with knife. And then just above that knife, the angel coming and stopping the hand of Abraham. So in this foreground space, we have a depiction of Abraham and Isaac, a father sacrificing his only son, but also an Old Testament prototype of that. As you move through the window, you see the fulfillment of that. God the Father sacrificing his only son, Jesus the Christ, as an echo. And so in this way, Old Testament and New Testament get connected through the device of that window and faith and prayer. All right, really, really smart device. Okay, let's move to something else now. Where we're going to go now is up to the Netherlands and begin to look at some Netherlandish painters. Just in terms of chronology, we are in the 1400s. Of course, we'll just call it the 14th century in the north rather than Quattrocento. That's an Italian term. We're at about the year 1423 to 5. So you might be, when you're studying this, you might line that up with Masaccio. And this is kind of the counterpart in the north. Our painter here is Robert Campan and assistants. The Renaissance era artists always worked in a workshop, and Robert Campan would have been the master of the workshop and would have had assistants that helped him paint. So these things are not entirely by a single hand usually. That was the way art was made in those days. Well, what we're looking at here is a triptych, three-part painting again. This is an altarpiece, so it would have been mounted on the back of an altar. This is also a fairly small painting. It's only about maybe 3 to 4 feet wide. So it's a more intimate scale, probably for a private chapel. This actually has another name that it mostly goes by, which is the Merode altarpiece. And Merode is spelled Merode. It has to do with the where it is and so on. We won't worry about that. So the Merode altarpiece, and its subject is the Annunciation. Now here you're starting to encounter this Northern Renaissance style again. You can see that the figures are not really classical. They're quite naturalistic, but they're not classical. They're not quoting Greek and Roman beauty and dignity. Instead, the figures are very detailed and precise and very intentionally set into domestic settings, into a house, courtyard of a house on the left, and the living room of a house in the center, and a side room there on the right. There's all kinds of objects around them. So this is going to be a nice case of where the truth is more in the careful detail than in the large abstract forms. And in fact, that's a really giant idea that's central to the Northern Renaissance, this idea of embedded symbols and meaning. And it works like this. They tend to portray natural daily life with great affection. Lots of detail, lots of beauty to it, glowing light, jewel-like colors, precise contours and edges, and little tiny details that you would see in ordinary life, and then to imbue that with a divine meaning. We all have this expression, God is in the details. That's very much a Northern aesthetic attitude. And so part of what happens with these is we're drawn in to inspect the details, and in doing that, we find all kinds of rich meaning. So I want to move through this kind of bit by bit. Um, we're going to spend some time on that center panel, the Annunciation. That's the most important, of course. But I first actually want to start with that left side, that left panel or wing. And in that, you see two people kneeling. These are very specific portraits, and they're portraits of the people who paid for this. They are the donors, the patrons. So these are what we call the donor portraits. And so interesting, they are actually kneeling in an exterior space, kind of a courtyard to a house, probably their house. You can see a bit of their garden there and the wall behind them, and actually behind the woman's head, you can actually see a door or a gate going out onto the street. So this is partly very much to say, this is us in our time, in our present reality, in nature, in secular or profane space. Now remember that device of the window that takes us into spiritual space. In this case, Campan uses the door to do that. So as you look at those kneeling figures, they're actually outside looking through a door. Let's get a detail going here. There they are, looking through that door. And of course, through that door is the sacred space of the center panel, where the angel Mary comes down and announces, where the angel Gabriel comes down and announces to Mary that she's going to have the Christ child. This is wonderful use of space and door. External space is natural, secular, and internal space is sacred. Now, while we're doing this, this is a nice time to focus on this almost obsession with careful detail that the North loves. Look at the back of that door, for example. You can see every nail that's been used to put it together. You can see the keys in it. You can see the wood graining. This kind of love of the detail of concrete reality is very present here. Here's a couple of other details. You get a little closer into the dual portrait here of the donors. You'll notice he's removed his hat in respect and prayer. You'll notice she is holding the rosary with her hands folded, so she's in the act of prayer. But they're kneeling in very in very secular space. In fact, you can see, I don't know, one of their servants or something standing behind them. Next to him, you can actually see the door that goes out into the street. If you look at that detail on the right there, you can actually see people coming and going in that street. There's a guy riding his horse by there and a woman sitting on a bench across the street. So this is as if to say, daily life is daily life. We do our work, we ride our horse, we go about, but hidden in that is the sacred, is the divine. And we see that, we encounter that through prayer, through devotion. And so as they are kneeling in that secular world looking through that door, they're seeing something quite miraculous that happened in the first century. Let's go back to that center panel and see what they're seeing. And there we see this Annunciation, right? Let's get a detail of that. So here we see that center panel where the Annunciation occurs. There's a lot of really great stuff going on in this panel, so let's dwell on it for a minute. You'll notice our setting is actually a very 15th century Netherlandish living room in which a holy spiritual event occurs. That's part of this Netherlandish idea that you celebrate the daily, the ordinary, but you find the divine within it. And of course, in the first century when that Annunciation happened, it would have been in a very ordinary daily space where the young Mary lived. So here we see Mary. She's humbly seated low because she is the low handmaiden of God. And she's reading a text, which of course would be the Hebrew scriptures, probably reading the prophet Isaiah that foretells the coming of Christ. As she reads, to the left, the angel Gabriel rushes in, salutes her, and the Annunciation happens. Now, these figures, by the way, you'll notice are rather large in scale. That doll's house space is still happening, and there's a kind of an intuitive perspective happening. Let's kind of look at how he uses space and location and symbol to give us the deeper meanings of this Annunciation that's occurring. And to do that, I want to focus on that table in the middle. It kind of tips up in intuitive perspective. You can see the tabletop as an oval or circle. Notice how the angel's hand comes just into the inner edge of that, which draws our attention to the space on that table. And on that table are three things that give us insight. First is that book there on the front edge of the table. You'll notice its pages are ruffling as if there's a wind blowing. And of course there is a wind blowing, because whenever angels arrive, they arrive with a wind. But that wind also can be the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. And so that wind blows the pages of this book. So what book is this? This is going to be probably Isaiah, because Isaiah prophesies the coming of the Christ. So that's a truth, and the Holy Spirit activates that book. Excuse me. I'm reminding us of that truth. But then look just to the right of that book. You see a single candlestick holder and candle. And that candle had a flame that has just been blown out. You can see a curl of smoke rising up above the wick and curling up into the air. All right, this is strange, because typically a lit candle is a symbol of light and truth. So why would that candle have been blown out? This is a painting about the light and truth of God in the Scriptures. Well, that light would represent the light of the Old Testament, the book whose pages are blowing in the wind there. And the light of the Old Testament was the law. The Old Covenant, Old Testament, was a covenant with us and God through the law. If we follow the law is like a lamp unto our feet, a light unto our eyes, as the psalmist says. So that was the light by which we knew God. But when the New Testament begins, we move into a new covenant, right? A New Testament. And the heart of that is grace, the Christ. So the illumination of the old now passes, snuffed out the light of the candle, to something new, illumination of grace through Christ in the incarnation. And if you look at Mary's abdomen, you see a starburst of light there. So this is the new light that's coming into the world. All right, let's go back to that table. So we've seen the book, we've seen the candle. The third thing on that is a ceramic pitcher. And out of that pitcher is coming a lily stem with flowers. The lily is a symbol of the Virgin Mary. And you'll notice that in this case, there are 3 flowers on that stem. So this is going to be the Trinity. But you'll notice 2 of those flowers are fully bloomed and 1 is still a bud. So what are the 2 fully bloomed ones? This will be the Father and the Holy Spirit, because that Old Testament tells us about God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. We can find those in the Old Testament. But it only implies or prophesies the second person of the Trinity, which is Christ. You might say that in the Old Testament, Christ is only a bud. And so the third flower there is still a bud, not yet fully opened, because Christ is not yet born. So you get this embedded symbolism, how it works. A couple other things let's point out. If you go to the back wall of that room, you see a niche with a pot hanging in it with water, and next to that a towel on a little towel rack hanging. In daily life, this would be for washing your hands and drying them. But in biblical life or spiritual life, this would be how in the Old Testament times, the Jews always cleansed their hands and dried them. But that towel actually is like the prayer shawl that Jews used with its stripes and its fringe. So again, Old Testament reference, but it slips into baptism reference, right? Cleansing in the water and the drying with the towel. So this is all about this movement from old to new. One other, there's lots of symbols in this, but let's just look at one other. Look to the upper left part of the painting, and on the wall you'll see two windows. Let's look at the first one. If you look at that window and then look just slightly down from the right of it, you see a little baby with a cross over its shoulder doing a nosedive down some rays of golden light. If you draw a line through his body and those golden light rays, they line up with that starburst of light on Mary's womb. So this is sort of the fetus Christ coming into the picture. He's just passed through that window. Now he's a very corporal little baby, but you'll notice he passed through the window without it needing to be open or without it being broken. This is a reference to the virgin birth. That window references Mary's womb and vagina, the virginity, her maidenhead still intact, and the idea that this baby could pass through without tearing that maidenhead, leaving her a virgin, is what's referenced here. So if you ever wonder how that happened, there is your answer. Let's look at the the right panel or wing on this Merode altarpiece. There you can see the word Merode, by the way. Out here we have an old man who's a carpenter working away in his shop. This, of course, will be Joseph, the husband of Mary, and so to speak, father of Jesus. He's a much older man, and that's true of much of the Catholic tradition that viewed Joseph as an older man, more as a caretaker of Mary than a husband. And in fact, part of Catholic theology argues that Mary remained a virgin her entire life, and that's a little easier to believe if Joseph is an older man. So there he is working in his workshop. What's he making? He's actually making a mousetrap. And there's one sitting on the table right in front of him. And then if you look at the window on the back wall, you see there's a panel that's folded down, almost like an ironing board, that extends out into the street, and there's a mousetrap sitting on that. This is where people would just come up to his shop and buy a mousetrap. So what's with the mousetrap thing? Well, of course, this is an embedded symbol. There is an old kind of story, and in fact, scholars have found this used in sermons in the 15th century in the Netherlands about the mousetrap as a metaphor. And it works like this. The mouse is understood to be Christ. Satan is the trap, and Satan tries to entrap Christ by having Christ killed. And therefore Satan thinks that he has won. But in fact, we all know he didn't win, that God resurrected Christ from death and in turn defeated Satan. So ultimately it was Satan that was trapped in his own wiles, not Christ. So this is a little sermon and paint through symbol, embedded symbol, and Joseph, of course, is there making that trap. But there's more to it than that. If you look at the tools on the table that he's using to make that trap, you see a hammer, you see tongs, you see nails. These are the very tools that were used to nail Jesus to the cross, and then later to remove the nails to take him down from the cross. So, in other words, Joseph is building the very trap that Satan used to catch Jesus, but he's also used the same tools that were used to release Jesus from the cross once he was dead, which will enable the resurrection to happen. And of course, Joseph, as a carpenter, might have also made a cross. So all of that's all kind of embedded in this altarpiece. So if you went to church and took the Eucharist and meditated on this altarpiece, you'd get quite a visual sermon. All right. Let's move to another work and another painter. Still the Netherlands, and our painter here is Jan van Eyck. We're looking at a double portrait, the Arnolfini portrait. Sometimes this is also called the Arnolfini wedding portrait, because in fact this is a painting of two people that are betrothed taking their vows in marriage. So it's a great painting. It's on one level it's a double portrait, on another level it's a document of them getting married, which tells us a lot about marriage actually. And actually on a third level, this actually was a legal document. When you get married, you have a license and you have to have witnesses to your marriage who heard the vows. And then that witness has to sign the marriage license to say that it's legal, that you got married. This actually was serving as that. I'll show you a detail in a minute, but if you look on the back wall, you see a mirror in a round frame. And just above that mirror on the wall, you see writing. And that writing is the signature of the witness, who was Jan van Eyck, who made the painting. And we'll come to that in a minute. So let's talk about marriage here. This is a wonderful marriage ceremony, a little different than the way we do it. So as they're exchanging their marriage vows, where are they actually? Well, they're standing in the bedroom. So this is probably not literal. It's probably not likely that they got married in the actual bedroom. This is a symbol. So as we look into this painting, they're getting married in the bedroom, which is to say that deep thing from Genesis, the two become one flesh. This is what consummates a marriage, is two people coming together, saying their vows before God, and then consummating that through sex, becoming one flesh and uniting. So it's a metaphor for that. It's also a metaphor for the sacredness of that. In the Catholic tradition, marriage is a sacrament. It's holy ground. And so we have this as a portrayal of marriage as sacrament. Now, if it's holy ground, then there's got to be a lot of these embedded symbols suggesting the meaningful theology of marriage. So let's find some of those symbols. There's a lot in this painting. We're only going to look at a few. Let's start in the foreground there to the left, where you see a pair of sandals. And in fact, if you look at Mr. Arnolfini, he's standing there in his socks, his black tights, his stockings. Why are his sandals off? Well, that's an old symbol. It goes all the way back to Moses and the burning bush, where Moses was told to remove his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. Marriage is holy ground. The bedroom is holy ground. And so he has removed his sandals for this sacramental exchange of oaths in the bedroom, entering into marriage. As long as we're down there on the floor, let's move over to the center part where you see this really great little lap dog, cute little guy. And he's standing between this couple. His tail overlaps the toes of Mr. Arnolfini, and the front of him overlaps the hem of the dress of the bride. And of course, there's a long-standing symbolism of a dog. A dog stands for fidelity, for faithfulness. People actually used to name their dog Fido, Latin for faithful. And we all still think of a dog as a faithful friend, right? Man's best friend. Well, in this painting, of course, faithfulness stands for the fidelity that we have within marriage. Once you exchange those vows, you are only for each other, and that's part of the holiness of marriage. So you see how this is working, right? Every element telling us about the meaning of marriage, at the same time giving this really great detailed portrait of their ordinary daily life. So let's move on up. Let's look at her for a minute. Dressed in her nice wedding dress, not a white dress, but a green dress. Green is a color for fertility, for fecundity, and of course part of the joy of marriage is that we have children. That's part of the fertility of this sacrament. It literally generates new life. And so that's what this green symbolizes. You'll also notice that she, is fairly large in the tummy. Probably not best to think that she's already pregnant. This is probably simply a reference to the fact that she will become pregnant as the marriage is consummated. And that's part of the joy of it. There's also another layer, however, to that sort of larger tummy, and that is that in the Northern Renaissance, they do develop an ideal of beauty, both male and female, and she represents that ideal of female beauty. It's a very different body type than we see in the North, where the idealized Greek-like figure is favored. Um, Here, the favoring is more of kind of women as we typically are. Very few of us look like goddesses or gods walking about. Woman often is more pear-shaped, and that pear-shaped image is what the Northern finds as the ideal of feminine beauty. So let's go to a detail. Here you can see her a little more clearly. You can also notice that behind her actually is the bed with its curtains that you would draw around to keep yourself warm. So the reference to the bed and the sexual act is very clear. I want you to notice to the left of her in the background, we have some other elements. Let's get a detail here. Love his hat, by the way. Fabulous hat. So here they are exchanging their vows. And I want to draw your attention to the wall in the background because we have some elements there that are important. For one thing, you can see that chandelier hanging down. It has a single candle referencing their unity. And then in the background is that mirror. You can see that writing now on it. Notice to the left of the mirror, there's a rosary hanging there. What we have back here are elements referencing how marriage works. And that rosary, of course, references prayer. And prayer is one of the things we need in marriage. Marriage is not easy. We need prayer. We need faith at the center of our marriage. And so there's that prayer rosary. In the very center is this mirror. Let me get a detail. There on the right, you can see the full mirror and the rosary. And on the left detail, you can see in that mirror. This mirror is fabulous. By the way, notice what a brilliant painter Jan van Eyck is. This painting's about 2 feet wide and 4.5, 5 feet high. So that mirror on the back is not much bigger than maybe the palm of your hand, if that. And then you can actually see the reflection in the mirror. Part of what Van Eyck is doing here is having a lot of fun with space, an intuitive perspective, because in that mirror you actually see their backs reflected. So look at their backs there, and then look in between them, reflected in the mirror. You see 2 other figures. The prominent one is the priest who's guiding them through the marriage ceremony. And then just behind the priest in red, you see another figure kind of looking over the priest's shoulders. That's actually a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck witnessing this marriage. And as I said earlier, this is a marriage document. He is the witness. Now, to be legal, the witness has to sign the document. So if you look at the detail on the right, you see the mirror, and above that, you see Jan van Eyck's signature, Johannes van Eyck Vuit Hout, which means Jan van Eyck was here and had made this, and you see a date. So now it's a legal document. One other thing here, as you're looking at that mirror, this is a concave mirror, a mirror that curves outward. We sometimes use the word a fisheye mirror. And you can see that the space of the room, which you're able to see, is actually distorted by the curvature of that mirror. This gets pretty cool because this is just cool. His ability to use space to depict space. If you look at the whole painting, you see space straight. If you look in this painting, you see space curved. But now this is another embedded symbol. This is God's eye. God's eye sees all, right? Our eyes see focused perspective. God's eye sees all, more panoramic. And of course, God's eye is exactly what you want in the center of your marriage, because marriage should be grounded in God and in faith. All right, so there's God's eye, right, in the center of that frame, as a mirror, as a concave mirror. Now, look at the frame around the mirror. It has a whole bunch of little circular paintings. These paintings are now smaller, about the size of your little fingernail. They're very, very precise. And they have images. In fact, at the very top one, you can make out the crucifixion. What these images going around the mirror are the stations of the cross. And they orbit around that mirror. In other words, Christ's passion, his suffering and sacrifice for us, rings around God's eye. This is all about incarnation, Christ, grace, and these are things we need in our life. These are things that make marriage sacred and that help us through marriage. Okay, one last observation. Look again at that rosary that's hanging just to the left of the mirror. This is tiny, your fingernail size. And look how carefully those beads are painted, how they're reflecting light, how you can see the shadow of each bead on the wall. This is God in the details, right? This celebration of the particular as opposed to the general. The Italian Renaissance loves the general, the broad form, the heroic stance, the monumentality, the abstract simple shapes. The Northern Renaissance loves the particulars, the specifics. All right, and there we are. There's the whole again. You can put it back together. I want to stay with Jan van Eyck, but look at another major accomplishment by him. An accomplishment that's known as the Ghent altarpiece. It was in the town of Ghent, in the church there. Unfortunately, this altarpiece has lost much of its original frame, its original setting. You're looking here at a drawing that reconstructs how the whole thing probably would have been. Altar there in the foreground, and then the great altarpiece up behind it. We're going to go in and look at the paintings in that that are saved in the altarpiece, but like I say, sadly, we've lost the larger frame. So let's move into that. Now, before we do, though, look at that whole thing. You see the paintings that are in it. Netherlandish altarpieces have a dimension that is kind of rare in Italy, but you're gonna witness it here in the Northern Renaissance. And that feature is that they actually consist of multiple panels, and those panels are hinged, so they can be open and shut. They're painted on the front and on the back, and so by different configurations of panels being open or shut, you get different scenes in the altarpiece. So I want to show you this Ghent altarpiece, but I'm first going to show it to you in what we would call the closed position, where the wings are closed. So here's how it looks. There's a lot of verbiage there. Don't worry about that. Let's just look at the image. So when the altarpiece is just there normally, there's no mass, no church ceremony going on, these would be closed. And so in the closed position, this is what you would have seen in the center of the Ghent altarpiece. So what do we have here? Across the bottom, we have 4 niches. In the outer 2 niches, you see portraits of a man and a woman in color. Very detailed, very precise. By now you know what this is. These are the donors that paid for this. So these are the donor portraits, kneeling in prayer and humility. In the center between them, you see 2 more niches. And in these you see sculptures. These are saints, as John the Baptist, and I'm forgetting the woman, she's a martyr, I'll think of her in a minute, St. Lucy, I think it is. So these are the patron saints of Ghent and of this church and of those patrons. They are painted to look like sculpture. They're not really sculpture. It's all illusionistic painting. And you see, by the way, how brilliant Jan van Eyck is as a painter in his ability to create that illusion. So that's across the lower part. Raise your eyes up now, go across the center part, and there you see into a room. And clearly here the parts of the altarpiece are treated as a window through which we look into this room. The perspective here is fairly accurate. It's not quite accurate linear, but it's pretty accurate. But the scale is not. It's very much doll's house space. And so the scene here is the Annunciation. On the left, you see the angel entering this room. On the right, you see Mary kneeling and reading the scripture. And above her head, the dove of the Holy Spirit descending. So this is the Annunciation. Now, this is the complexity of this whole business of altarpiece, panels, closed, open, windows that we see through. So in the closed position, Jan van Eyck is drawing us to the gospel. And so on the outside, he shows us the Annunciation, which is the beginning of the gospel, right? When these open, we'll be taken into New Testament times, and we'll understand the fulfillment of the gospel. So this closed position, outer, is like a preliminary. So Annunciation, and then above that, you see four little figures. These are Old Testament prophets. They're kind of tucked up in the attic of that room, trying to peer out. They've got books there that they've written. So these will be Isaiah and Daniel and the prophets that foretell the coming of the Christ. Okay, so now what would happen is the priest would open the panels. A little hard to see in a slide, but there's a split right down the middle of this. And there's hinges on the left and right. So those panels would open outward and you would get this. So here's our center panel once those wings are opened. And you can see that it opens up into this vast, wide, gorgeous landscape below that runs all the way across all the panels. And then above, a series of individual panels with figures. So down below, what we have is a visionary painting actually of the new heavens and the new Jerusalem, the new earth. So this is post-book of Revelation, when all is fulfilled. And at the center of that, you see the mystic lamb standing on an altar, and he's being worshipped from all sides in a beautiful landscape, in the background of which is the new Jerusalem. And then in the wings, all sorts of folks from the history of the church coming to adore him. Above, you see Christ in the center panel, now fully enthroned and ruling over the universe, blessing us with that hand gesture. To the left, the Virgin Mary. To the right, St. John the Baptist, key figures in the Christ's story. And then moving outward to the left and to the right, two panels with choirs of angels. On the left, they're singing. On the right, they're playing musical instruments, a pipe organ and a harp. And then outermost left and right, Adam and Eve, naked and ashamed, founding fathers of the human race, founding parents of the human race. Here, by the way, you get a sense of the northern ideal of beauty, kind of ordinary shaped folks. We'll come to that in a minute with details. And then above Adam and Eve, these little quarter panels that actually tell the story of Cain and Abel. So that above Adam, you see Cain and Abel bringing their offerings to God, Abel bringing the lamb, Cain bringing a sheaf of wheat. As you know, one was accepted, one was not, which caused anger and led to the first pair of brothers' murder. And above Eve, you see that murder where Cain is murdering Abel in his anger. So this total altarpiece is super visionary. It begins with, Annunciation when it's closed, ends with visionary scene of the new creation, new heaven and new earth, and the adoration of the Lamb and Christ enthroned in the center. So here's our center panel. You can see that gorgeous landscape. Notice the atmospheric perspective, by the way, in the back, where the blue tones of that ancient, or that deep, deep landscape are played out. I guess I'm not going to say a whole lot more, just to let you see this in its beauty. Oh, okay, I lied. I'm going to say a little bit more, because you can see in this panel, the mystic lamb are standing on the altar. There's a chalice on the altar right in front of him, and the lamb's breast is actually cut open, and there's a spurt of blood coming out and filling that chalice. So obviously this is the sacrificial blood of Christ the Lamb filling the chalice, which is the wine for our Eucharist, that mystical union of us and Christ when we take communion. By the way, the crowds of people coming out of the trees and bushes there on the left and right. On the left are all males, on the right are all females. If you can see in detail, each of them is holding a palm frond, and that's the symbol of martyrdom. And these, in fact, are all the martyrs from the history of the church gathering. They sacrificed their lives for Christ as well. Okay, a couple other details here. There's that interior of Christ enthroned, singled out. You can notice, of course, the amazing detail, the light on his jewels, and so on, as he blesses us. I want to focus for a minute on the details of Adam and Eve, because here, of course, we have the naked human figure. I'll say naked because they were naked and ashamed. Nude is unfallen or ideal or beautiful. So here's Adam in his fallenness. This is the Northern European ideal of the human figure. It's not the classical idealized figure of Greece reborn in the Renaissance. Instead, it's very specific. He's kind of scrawny and lots of specific details. Very different sensibility of human and human body in the North. In some ways, more down to earth, more the way we really are. And here again, you see what a genius painter Jan van Eyck is. The incredible detail, every hair, reflection of light in his eyes, creases in his forehead. There's a humanity, a commonness, and I dare say an ordinariness to the humans in Northern Renaissance painting. Now, this is 1430s, okay, so way before the Reformation. But I think we start to see why maybe the Reformation would happen in the North and not in Italy. When the Reformation happens, Martin Luther will champion the ordinary individual, the priesthood of every believer. He will argue that every individual has direct access to God through prayer and faith and reading the scripture. There's already a 100-year tradition or more of celebrating the common individual in the North. It's part of their DNA, really. So I think it's not surprising that the Reformation will happen in the North. Let's look at Eve. Here you see Eve. Here you see more clearly that Northern European ideal beauty of the female form. Very much a pear-shaped, large abdomen and hips, small breasts, and very much an ordinary kind of face. Eve here is holding the fruit. Now this is kind of an interesting, fun element. If you look at that fruit, it is not an apple. The biblical text never says apple. Somehow it came to be an apple. But in the Northern Renaissance, they were quite aware that it was not an apple. So what was it? Well, this is a weird little knobby fruit. And in fact, scholars have obsessed over this fruit. It does not look like any fruit known to humanity, which is kind of a great invention, maybe by Van Eyck. If this was fruit plucked from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what would that look like? Who knows? And so he invents a fruit. It's so realistic, you're sure it's actual. but it's actually not any fruit that we know. It's kind of appealing but knobby, good and evil. Okay, that's pretty fun. Here's Eve up close. All right, so you get the idea. Oh, that's a little bit out of order, but that's okay. Let's look at another Netherlandish painter, Roger van der Weyden. And let's look at a portrait this time, portrait of a lady. We don't know who she is. This is the northern ideal of the ideal portrait and the beauty of a woman. And so here she's dressed in this kind of elegant but simple dress with this kind of headpiece that's diaphanous. You can actually kind of see through it. You can see her forehead and her hair all braided up with some jewels in it. Kind of somber portrait. Remember, portraiture in the Quattrocento in Italy tended to be profile. This one's actually kind of a three-quarter view, and he's just celebrating her beauty by all this detail. Also notice, by the way, her high forehead. We talked about this ideal of beauty, the high brow, where the hair is plucked back, so you get that beautiful global domed forehead there to gaze upon. All right, terrific portrait. I want to look at one religious piece by van der Weyden, the Deposition, because it's so northern, it's so brilliant. Basically, he gives us this scene in a very flat, shallow space on a little shelf of landscape there across the foreground. It's very compressed. It actually reminds us of the relief sculpture on churches, and it probably comes from that. We know that Roger, before he was a major painter, learned his trade by painting sculptures. And there's a very sculptural feel to his figures. It's part of what gives them their concrete reality. He then shifted to painting, but many of his paintings have this kind of iconic feel of relief sculpture, painted in these really brilliant colors. Now, this is a great theme. It'll be painted many, many times, the Deposition, which is essentially Christ being taken down from the cross. You see the cross there in that higher center part of this altarpiece. A man in the background has climbed a ladder and is lowering Jesus down. He's being received there by Joseph of Arimathea, and his feet held by, no, actually, he's probably being received by Nicodemus, and the feet held probably by Joseph of Arimathea as he's taken down in death. Around him are the disciples. To the far right will be Mary Magdalene. Remember, she's the one that wept on his feet and anointed his feet, and so she's there at his feet. In the blue dress in the center, of course, is the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. And you'll notice that she's fainting. And as she falls, her body position is the same as the body position of the dead Jesus. In Catholic devotion, there was a parallel between Christ's sufferings and Mary's sufferings. But hers are never quite as intense as his. So while he died, she faints. And it's kind of a devotional idea. And then she's caught by John there in the red to the right. Also want you to notice in the foreground there's a skull at John's feet, and at Mary's feet there's a femur bone, a leg bone. So what do these reference? You'll notice in many crucifixions there's a skull, a little bit less often another bone. These, of course, reference Adam. And it was actually believed in the medieval period that the place where Jesus was crucified was, in fact, the place where Adam had been buried. Now, we don't need to believe that literally to get the meaningful symbolism of that. Adam is the first man, and it was through Adam that death came. Jesus is described in Paul's epistles as the second man, and it was through him that redemption comes. Jesus is the new Adam. And so you have the first Adam and the new Adam in the resurrection, the redemption from death. All right, one last northern painting. Hugo van der Gogh, really great painter, triptych. I'm not going to dwell on this. I think you're getting the idea of these things. But I have a couple reasons for showing you this. You'll see the name of it is the Portinari altarpiece, and Portinari is an Italian name. This painting is important historically because it was actually commissioned by an Italian who had traveled north in his trade. He was a businessman, and he had fallen in love with this Northern Renaissance aesthetic. So he commissioned Hugo van der Gogh to do this great altarpiece, and then it was brought down to Florence where it was viewed. And this is part of how the North and the South Renaissance got to know each other by these travelers and by the bringing of a few works of art in journey. So this is an important piece for the kind of the influence of the North in Italy, particularly in northern Italy, as we'll see later. It is a wonderful painting, though. I love those shepherds that come bumbling in there to adore Christ. Let's look at that center panel. And here you see, again, all the same ideas, the detail, the embedded symbolism, and so on. And the idea of the common man here, those shepherds, are in no way idealized. They're very ordinary, common people. In fact, here's a detail of one, and you can see that this is just a working class guy who's come in astonishment to adore this Christ child. All right, about done here with this Northern Renaissance, but I want to look at one last piece because I want to get in another medium, the medium of printmaking. Printmaking is actually a big deal, and especially in the North. Once again, that kind of has to do with their openness to the ordinary person, because printmaking, you have multiples, right? You create a plate or a block, and you can print multiple images off of that on paper. What that means is that these are less expensive. More people can afford them. It's just a sheet of paper with a print and a multiple. And so in this way, art does spread among the middle class, the burgher class in the North. Now here we have one of the great printmakers, Martin Schongauer. He's actually German, he's not Netherlandish, but that's okay. These cultures interact with each other. And it's a theme you've not seen before, but I want to introduce you to because it comes up a lot in art history. St. Anthony, tormented by demons. St. Anthony was a desert father, late 3rd, early 4th century saint, who became a Christian in the corrupt Roman Empire, left that corruption and went to the desert to pray and meditate. He's one of the desert fathers, and this is ascetic Christianity, devoted to deep prayer and contemplation. St. Anthony became famous for his ability to overcome the temptations of the flesh. You'll see scenes of St. Anthony in the desert, tempted by a vision of lots of beautiful young women that are trying to seduce him. And he had learned that by prayer you can overcome any kind of temptation. And he became a very wise person that people actually flocked to the desert for counsel and wisdom and advice. We'll meet him a couple more times. So here he is. This scene is of one of his terrible, terrible temptations where he's beset by demons in his prayer. And these demons actually carry him up into the sky, and they pound and pinch and bite and attack him. But because he's a master of deep prayer, he remains utterly calm, attached to his book, his scripture, and actually staves off this horrible assault. One of the ways these images were used was devotionally. St. Anthony was an example of someone who taught you that you could overcome any temptation if you stayed close to God in prayer. And so the way this would have been used is any person, particularly if you're experiencing temptation, you might gaze on this image and remember Anthony and his wisdom, and how he was assaulted by devils, and that might help you realize that the assault of temptation right now will pass. So art used as devotion, as spiritual guide. Stylistically, of course, we have that obsessive detail, um, which printmaking gets at very nicely. And you really have to say you've got the greatest demons here. The German imagination for inventing demons is fabulous. And here you get some really pretty crazy demons. Okay, we will stop for there, and I'll talk to you next time. Hope you're well.